Today we are going to look into an example of consistent life, and this is found in the life of Daniel. And we can always open the Bibles in Daniel chapter 1 because we are going to read some Bible verses. But before we go there, I want to tell you a story. There was this person that he wanted to buy a horse, and he looked around where he could find it, and he found a good horse. And you know what happened? The horse started to work. It worked the first day, the second day, and then after a few days, the horse decided not to work. Probably you may think, well, this previous owner tricked me. The owner tried to beat him, to move him, to push him, but he was turning. I will take him and bring it back. Return. You do that with Amazon, with other things. You don't something, we return it. So this is what he tried to do with this horse. The next morning, when he wanted to return the horse wouldn't oppose this time. So he said, well, maybe the horse is fixed to work. He wouldn't move. So at that time, he takes the horse and brings him to this person, and he tells him why were the reasons why he's returning the horse. And the previous owner here waits and listens patiently. And at that time, when he understands that the horse doesn't work, this person asks him, what do you mean? You didn't work with him at all? And he said, well, it worked, but there is one day that he wouldn't work. And the previous owner asked, but what day is it? And the previous owner just laughs and he says, well, he will never work. And he's asking why? Well, he knows the why. And for that, I would like you to look at this. Today, the Sabbath, we should keep it holy, and we should not do any work, but it's also talk about our cattle or our animals. So this horse, how did this horse know to keep the Sabbath? Just think a little bit about that. Habits. How did he form habits? So his owner, previous owner, he was a Sabbath keeper. So on Saturday, this horse knew that he doesn't need to work. So the owner had a consistent life. Every week he would worship on Sabbath. And at this time, the horse decided, well, it's time to worship Sabbath, right? We are going to come back to this experience, but just think a little bit. You wouldn't push him. You wouldn't move him no matter what. Even when perils come, even when time of freedom is there, he wouldn't move because of those habits that Brother Patrick mentioned. So this is what we see in the life of Daniel. And just to have a historical setting, do you remember where was the book of Daniel written? I'm not asking you the year, but I'm asking you the place. In Babylon. So what was the connection? Why were they in Babylon? In captivity. And we learned during the Sabbath school that Israel has been in captivity in Egypt. And then they came out, and for some reason, they had to go back in captivity. And for this, I would like you to look at a few Bible verses in the book of Jeremiah. And here we will see a little bit why did they have to go there. Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 24, 25, and then we will read later on 27. So Jeremiah 17, 24 says, and it shall come to pass, if ye diligently hearken unto me, says the Lord, to bring in no burden through the gates of this city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath day, to do no work therein. Then shall there enter into the gates of the city kings and princes, sitting upon the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and this city shall remain forever. So what is this city that Jeremiah is talking here about? Is it Babylon or Jerusalem? Jerusalem, right? So we know later on that Jerusalem was conquered by Babylon. So what was the condition for this city to remain forever? To not be destroyed? What was the condition? Hallow the Sabbath, in other words, to have a consistent life in keeping the Sabbath. Was this the case, them keeping the Sabbath, or having this consistent life, fearing God? Let's read verse 27. It says that, but if you will not hearken unto me to hallow the Sabbath day, and not to bear a burden, even entering in at the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then will I do what? Kindle a fire in the gates thereof, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched. So what was the condition? For them to have a consistent life in keeping the Sabbath, and then the city will live forever. Meaning that even today, it will be there probably. But if you look into the history of the kings, and I will encourage you to look and to see the kings, the last kings of Judah, before Judah was Jerusalem was destroyed. And you will see that there was a king that he wanted to do reformation. So the spirituality would go up, the next king would come, then they would go back down. So they would go like that. So is this consistency? No. So this was the condition. But it's amazing that even though they had to go to Babylon, God always tries to make something good out of, even when people disobey it. Do you agree with that? Yes. Even when we disobey, God still wants to do something good out of it. And here we read in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 479, that in the land of their captivity, these men were to carry out what? God's purpose by giving the heathen nations the blessings that come through a knowledge of Jehovah. They were to be, what does it mean to be God's representative? Ambassadors, right? And in other words, they had to be a light within the walls of Babylon. So they disobeyed God. God allowed them to be taken as slaves. But even there, they had to continue being God's representatives. So today we are going to look at the spiritual aspect of it. Babylon versus Jerusalem. Do you know what is the difference between Babylon and Jerusalem? Yes?
One worship idol gods, and one worship the true and living God.
Yes. What does Babylon stand for as a symbol? Confusion. What else? Apostasy. What else? False doctrines, evil, and sin. So wherever you'll find in the Bible, throughout the Bible, the sin is symbolized by Babylon and Egypt, right? And Sodom and Gomorrah. But usually, the Bible talks about Babylon as sin. What about Jerusalem? Peace? City of God. I like that answer. So that means that God dwells there. It's a place where God dwells. And today we are going to look at these two. So think about Daniel and his friend taken from where? From Jerusalem, from the place of God, and brought where? In Babylon. In the middle of apostasy, were in the middle of sin. How would you survive? Prayer?
Rely on your habits.
Yes. Let us look more to see what Babylon means. And you brought good points that Babylon means confusion. And we see that there was always a battle between these two, Babylon and Jerusalem. And to look at this, we see that even in the book of Revelation, this name is carried out and is called to be the mother of harlots, meaning that it's the main actor in the society today, probably. Then, always, God is asking his people to do what? Come out from there. So in other words, all nations have been affected by it one way or another. Do you agree with that? One way or another, everyone says that has been affected, or says that all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and for that reason God is telling us to come out. So, looking at that, what does Babylon use to integrate us? What does Babylon use to integrate us? Because if you think about, I mentioned that Daniel and his friends were taken from Jerusalem, brought to Babylon. And if you do it right away, saying, okay, you don't worship your God, worship this idol, would you do it? No, because you know that this is not the God whom I should serve. So in other words, when Daniel got to Babylon, Babylon tried to integrate him. And let's look, you can open your Bibles in Daniel chapter 1. And let's read from verse 3 and go down. So in Daniel chapter 1, verse 3. And here we see, we have a long list of events, but we see the steps that Babylon is taking to integrate Daniel and his friends. And says that, and the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princess. How were these children that they were called? In verse 4. How were these children that they were selected? Children without blemish. Thank you. But well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace. And here is the first step, whom they might teach. So the question was, how Babylon is trying, how is Babylon trying to integrate us? The first one we see here, that is to teach them.
Teach them their language.
To teach their language. And see here the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans, and the Chaldeans were the people living in Babylon. Then the second one was verse 5. The king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank. So nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. And then the other steps were, here is telling us who they were in verse 6, that they were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And what was the next step? Change their names. So you see that to everyone, they got a new name. And if we look at the Bible perspective about that, why were the names important in the Bible's perspective?
We see that in the Revelation, God will give us a new name.
Well, we'll pray for that, that the Lord will give us a new name. But look at this. Names had a special meaning in the Bible time, so the king tried to influence these young men by changing their names. And first, we have Daniel. What does Daniel mean? Yes, God is my judge. In other words, when you would call Daniel, what would Daniel hear? God is my judge. Can you forget God when everyone is calling you, reminding you that God is your judge? Can you forget God in that way? So then he got a different name, which is keeper of the hid treasures of Baal. So in other words, instead of hearing, God is my judge, God is my judge, he hears a strange God, right? So this was the second step. We are going to come back to this later on. So just to see some important facts, young people, they were not ordinary people. If you remember, we read that they were from the king's seed. In other words, they were royal princes. And why is this important? We see that if you could change, or if you could gain the leaders on your side, you gained the whole people. Also, they were young. That means that they were teachable. It's different, like if you take Brother Patrick and try to teach him in the wrong, to try to teach him in that way, with whom would you have success? Yes. So they were young and they were teachable. So again, what does Babylon use to integrate us? And this is a spiritual application even for us today. You see education, and it's okay, it's good to have education, but think about that. Is this worldly education bringing us closer to God? No. So we will see how Daniel handles that, right? And then we have the food and drinks. It's tasty, and I think my wife brought a good point, because I like watermelons, you know, and I wanted to buy watermelons, but always when we would look at, she would say, well, these are seedless. And at that time, if you look at Genesis chapter 1, 29, what food is the Lord telling us to eat? Things that have seed in it, right? So this is talking about vegetarian food. I'm not even going further than that. So it is tasteful, it's good, pleasant to eat, but is this healthy? So this Babylon, the food that was given to them, we will see later on that the food is intended also to degrade their mind. Yes. So they are not able to make decisions between good and evil. So this is how Babylon is trying to confuse our minds, or to integrate us. And if you look at the constitution of Babylon, we know that by the time of Nebuchadnezzar, by this time, there were so many evil things happening. But the way they progressed, it was difficult for you to look at them and see those evils coming. Because they were sowing the seed, and they were evolving, and you wouldn't even notice them evolving. So the same is even today, in other words. So many evils going, but for us it's normal already to see them. And the third aspect was to change their names. And today, maybe people are not changing our names. Like, I'm still Gabriel, even though I came to America, right? But how is Babylon trying to integrate us? You have probably heard about, wherever you look at someone's names, you see there a PhD or so many things, that those things sometimes are more important than what they say than what God said. Well, the doctor told me to do that, so I should eat this way. The first one, the names. And we discussed a little bit about the important aspect of the names. So Daniel, he was hearing always, God is my judge. He would never be able to forget who the true God is. But now he got a new name. Then Hananiah, what does Hananiah mean? Can he forget God?
No.
He could go even in the desert, but he will always know that this is my name. God is with me. I am the gift of the Lord. And he got a new name. That's the inspiration of the sun. Inspiration of the sun. Like all these sun worshippers. And this will, you would put a name that would remind them about their gods, right? Then you have Mishael, he that is a strong God. Again, he cannot forget God. Instead of that, he got the name of the goddess Shaka, under which name Venus was worshipped. And Azariah, help of the Lord. You see that all of them have something to do with God. And he got the name servant of the shining fire, which they also worshipped. So that's why it's important, even though they had the legal name, I would say, it would be important for them to remember who they really are. So going further, education. And here we see in verse 4 that they wanted to teach them their language. And how many of you speak more than one language? Let's see. More than one language. So when you speak English, how is your personality? Is the same as you speak the other one? No. There is a saying that says that learn a new language and you get a new soul. And that's true, I experienced that. Because when I speak Romanian, I am not that direct as I am when I speak English. Because with the Romanian words, you can make someone upset just by the way you arrange them. You can use the same words, but the way you say them, you may make someone upset. So with English, it's different, right? So that's why they were trying to teach them a new language. It says that language changes the cultural views, which changes the thought process, which in turn changes also the behavioral pattern. And what is the next possible step in the long term or in the long run with that? Brother Patrick, I'm asking, so you came here, right? And now when you go back to your country, do you behave the same like they? Yes, you feel that there is a difference. You don't understand what's the difference, but you are different than them. Maybe the way you act, the way you walk, the way you dress, something is different. So the next possible step in the long term is a change of personality. So that's how, another step, how Babylon tries to integrate Daniel and his friends. Change their names, change language, change their personality, and they will, even though they were born in Jerusalem, they act as Babylonians. I mean, that was the plan with them. The next one, a question for you now, was how was Daniel able to stand this kind of education? Because we see later on that he was not moved. He was living the same consistent life that he had when he left Jerusalem. So how did he deal with that? How was he not deceived when this education was given to him? Praying, that's good. Sticking with God, that's another important thing. But I think Brother Chris brought a different answer. Practicing the habits that you already formed. And thinking about that, in Proverbs chapter 22, we read there a verse where it says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And from this verse, we may think that when he is old, like, what do you call old? 50, 60, 80? That's what you call old, right? But in fact, if you look at the wordings, in the original it says that when the child, or when the man, he starts to have hair on his beard. So that's when he is old. So at this time, Daniel was about 17. He was a teenager, and he was able to continue in that way because he was trained up when he was a young person. So now going more, how do we know that he was already trained? Mm-hmm.
He has a habit.
He has habits, yes. But if we think about that, we see that that's the reason why he was selected. Because it says that when the king made the command to bring him children with no blemish, but to be well favored and to be skillful in all wisdom. In other words, can you take a child like that he didn't go through any education? Is he skillful in everything? What about science, like mathematics?
Training.
So that means that Daniel and his friends, they were already graduated from something. And we see that, and we learn from the record that these were already skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and had ability in them to stand in the king's palace. In other words, they had already acquired a good degree of education, and their physical and mental powers were so far developed that a skillful reader of human nature could form quite an accurate estimate of their capabilities. So in other words, probably when you go to register into a new degree, how do they know that you are compatible to learn music?
Sing your challenge.
Yeah, probably Sister Tabitha can tell us. Yes, audition, right? You go there, and if you don't pass audition, you are not selected. The same with Daniel. If he wouldn't be graduated already in something, he would not be selected. So going further, how did they acquire this education? Have you heard of any good schools in Jerusalem? Because we know that in Babylon, at that time, it was the world, the world center of education, like you would hear about today Oxford or something like that. So what about Jerusalem?
School of the prophets.
School of the prophets. By this time, when the kings were going up and down, those schools were not working anymore. So how did they acquire this education? And in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6, 3-9, we are not going to read all those verses, but as you look here, it says that the Lord gave some commands to Israel. He says that, "Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe to do it, that it may be well with thee, and that ye may increase mightily, as the Lord God of thy fathers had promised thee, in the land that floweth with milk and honey." And it says that you should you should remember that the Lord our God is one Lord. This is one of the teachings that we should always remember. "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul." Another teaching that they had to remember. "And this word which I command thee this day shall be where? In thine heart." Right? So these were some education that the Lord commanded Israel to have. And then what was the next thing that the Lord commanded? "Thou shalt teach them diligently unto whom?" Whom is the Lord talking to here?
Parents.
To parents, right? "And shall talk of them when thou sittest in thy house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up." So in other words, every time the parents, they had to remember this, to teach their children. What? To teach their children everything that they heard. That the Lord is one God, that you should love the Lord with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and also to have them in their hearts, right? So this was the teachings. So Daniel and his friends, they were trained by their parents. And how do we know that? In the New Testament, we have an example, and probably you remember this. It's in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. And this is Paul talking to Timothy, right? And it says that, "When I call to remembrance the unfighting faith," right? He's talking about his faith that is in you, "which dwelt first in whom? Grandmother. And second in whom? Mother. And third in Timothy." So that means that the grandmother taught The daughter, right?
That's right.
And the daughter taught the son. So this is how this education was obtained even by Daniel. And we look at here, it says that Daniel had what? A godly mother who knew the prophecy concerning the destruction of their city. She repeated to her son the words of God that someday Hebrew children must stand in the hidden court at Babylon. Carefully did this mother teach her son to read the parchment scrolls of the prophets. And this education was not gained in the schools of the time, for they had departed from the plan of God. But holy mothers, living close to the everlasting Father, led their children by precept and example, by word and song, to form characters that would stand the test. Okay, so going back to Daniel, how was he able to stand the education offered in Babylon?
Habit.
By the grace of God.
By the grace of God, but he had this background. So when you have this background, you could go even to study philosophy or whatever this world gives you. But you'll always remember that the Lord, God is one God. I should love the Lord with all my heart, with all my mind, with all my soul. Put it, all these words where? In my heart. And wherever I go, whatever I do, these things are like the foundation or whatever I study next. So this is how Daniel was able to stand. And also, if you look at here, it says that this education was not gained in the school of the time because they had departed from the plan of God. Can you say that this is happening even today?
Yes.
Yes.
That's why they homeschool.
True, that's why it's a homeschool. And what do you call the homeschool? That the holy mothers are preparing the way, the children, for when they go to different schools. And we see that at this time, Daniel is in Babylon, and he is to make his own decisions. Until now, the parents made decisions for him. How long did it take him to purpose in his heart not to defile himself? How much time did he have? A week?
17 years.
Yes, but how long did it take him to make this decision? I'm not going to do this. In the Sanctified Life, page 19, says that Daniel did not long hesitate. What does that mean? Right away, he knew what he has to do. And he decided to stand firm in his integrity, let the result be what it might. So this was the experience of Daniel when Babylon was trying to integrate him even through this education. Do you remember what was the next step? So we learned that one was the changing of their names. Instead of remembering who God is, to remember their idols. Second was changing the language, or getting new education. What was the other one? The food and the drink. Thank you. And this was, we see in verse 5, we already read it. But what type of food and drink did the king offer them? Meat and wine. If you go somewhere to your friends that are not vegetarians, let's suppose that we have friends that they are not vegetarians. If you talk about meat and wine, what would they say about it? Is it good food or not? Yeah. Let's look at this. They were captives but royal. So though captives, they were royal children and they were treated as such. So the king, when he wanted to give him his wine and his meat, he didn't want to make fun of them. He wanted to treat them accordingly. So here we also see that his sincere object was to secure for them the best physical and mental development that could be attained. That's what the king wanted. But what were Daniel's thoughts about that? Was he happy? Being in slavery, you don't eat what you want, right? But now you could eat from abundance, whatever the king had. So what was his thought about that? We see that he said that he decided, or he purposed in his heart, not to defile himself. And then later on, he says that now God brought Daniel into favor and the tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. So when this prince of the eunuchs wanted to give them this food, what did he say? What did he say? So the king's wine was brought to them, and he said, no. What did he ask in return? Water, yes, that's good. This is in Daniel chapter 1. Then the meat was given to them, and again they said no. And as Brother Patrick mentions, they asked for pearls, right? So was the king's servant happy with this request? Why wasn't he happy? And if we look at verse 10, in verse 10, we see that he says that, and the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, what? I fear my lord the king. Why? Because in that society, and we will see later on, that in that times, it says that like many at the present day, he thought that an abstemious diet would do what? Would render this youth pale and sickly, in appearance and deficient in muscular strength, while the luxurious food from the king's table would make them ruddy and beautiful and would promote physical and mental activity. So the same like today, right? And I think we were laughing one evening because my wife came home from her work, and she was saying about this patient that she was taking care of, and he was trying to encourage her, saying that you are taking all the nutrients from the baby because you are not eating meat. You should eat so he will be strong. Right? So today is the same things happening. So why did they make such a request, right? Why did Daniel say that give us water and give us pearls? Why did they make such a request?
Because they had purpose to their heart to follow God.
If we look at the youth instructor, August 18, 1898, says that they did not move capriciously but intelligently. They decided that as flesh meat had not composed their diet in the past, it should not come into their diet in the future. And as wine had been prohibited to all who should engage in the service of God, they determined that they would not partake of it. So, are we in the service of God? Think about that. I don't know for how many of you were present for the prayer meeting on Wednesday. I remember Sister Tabitha making a comment saying that we all are God's workers. We all are God's workers, right? So you see that wine has been prohibited to all who should engage in the service of God. We are here in the service of God. You pray, whom do you pray to? God, right? So you are in the service of God even then. So they decided, why? Because they knew that wine was prohibited, so they didn't drink it before. They shouldn't drink it from now on. In other words, they wanted to have a consistent life. Then, they were given to them meat, flesh meat. And they said, no, give us pulse. What is pulse? So if you look at Revised Standard Version Bible, in the same chapter, the same verse, instead of pulse, we see the word vegetables. And also it says that pulse is a vegetable food of the leguminous kind, like peas, beans. And Baxter says that zeronym denotes all leguminous plants which are not reaped, but pulled or plucked, which, however wholesome, were not naturally calculated to render them fatter in flesh than others. So this is what they were asking for. And as you look here, that this did not compose their diet in the past. And at this time, they wanted again to have a consistent life, to continue no matter what. So they decided to continue eating that. And sometimes we may find ourselves like in the step to do a compromise. Like, I don't know how would you see yourself, because in that time, you know that if the king says so, you better do it. Because if you do not do it, there are consequences. Have you thought about that? Sometimes we may find it easier to say, well, I serve God as long as we have the freedom to. But they are trying to kill me if I don't do it now. We have the experience of Peter and of the apostles, says that when this came in contradiction with the law of God, says that then Peter and the others apostles answered and said, we ought to obey whom? God rather than man. And also if we think about why were they selected, we see that in them there was no blemish. In other words, pure food, you have clean thoughts. And also, physical exercise place them on a higher level than others. So this made them without blemish. Just think about Daniel drinking wine before, or going to parties and drinking before he got to Babylon. Do you know what wine does to your brain? Confusion, that's okay, because after a few hours you are back to normal. Just suppose that, right? But I read that also that drinking alcohol, it kills neurons. And if you keep killing neurons, how many neurons would you remain with? Think about that. So if Daniel had such life before, would he be without blemish? No. His mind would be degraded, and he wouldn't be without blemish. But going further than that, we see that after passing the test, they were allowed to be strict vegetarians for the rest of the time. And this we'll find in verse 15 and verse 16. It says that Melzar, after this years passed, after this test passed, says that took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and give them pulse for the rest of their time in there. And if we think about that, about the vegetarian diet, we see that Daniel and his friends, they did not eat any meat before that either. So we see that in the Garden of Eden, what was the diet at that time? Yes. What kind of vegetables and fruits? With seed, right? That's a good point still to look at. Then we think that the new earth, what kind of food would we have there? Fruits and the same vegetarian diet, right?
Yes.
Then we come to the time of the flood when the meat was allowed, because I had a question a few weeks ago. Why did the Lord give people to eat meat?
There was no vegetation after the flood.
Yes, that's true. But if you look at the lifespan between Eden and the flood,
It's shortened it.
yes, how long did the people live between the Eden and flood?
900.
Yes, 900 plus. Adam and Methuselah, we know that they lived longer, but I just put there 900. So after that, from the flood to 1800s, I would say, do you know how much or how long was the lifespan?
70 years.
That's a good hope.
120 years.
If you read in 1800s, the lifespan for women was 35 and for men 45. You can do your research on that. Was shortened, but to what degree was shortened? Just look the other one, 935 or 45. Really much, right? And in 1800, something interesting happened because we have the health reform introduced to the Advent movement. And even today, you'll see, if you go to stores, you'll see the healthy food, with the brand Kellogg on it probably. And this was inspired by from the health message. And do you know what is the lifespan between 1800s to today? Someone mentioned 70. And this is what it is today, 77, about that. So it increased when the health reform was reintroduced. But if we think about that, those preparing for heaven, they need to have a clear mind. So what does that mean?
Vegetarian diet.
The original God.
Yes. This is just a chart to see why did Daniel choose also to have a consistent life in this. And the reward of faithfulness says that at the end of the days that the king appointed, which was about 3 years, how was Daniel and his friends found? Not one time, not 2 times, but it says that it was none found as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Meaning that they were superior to all of them. And he found them 10 times better than all of them, magicians, astrologers, and all them that were in his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of the king Cyrus. So in conclusion, think about how this example should encourage us. Or what should we learn from this example? What would you learn from Daniel's example of having a consistent life? What do you take with you home today?
We should purpose in our hearts to follow.
To purpose in our hearts. What? To purpose in our hearts that whatever we eat, whatever we drink, and not just that, whatever we do, whatever we buy, whatever else, to do everything for the glory of God. And do you remember the horse that I was telling you about, right? So I mentioned that when he came, the new owner came to the previous owner with the horse saying that this horse is not good. The previous owner is showing him the Bible saying that, you see, that's why he is racing on Sabbath. And at that time, this person took more studies and he became a Sabbath keeper also. Amen. The new owner. And you can think about this horse as being a missionary horse, right? Right? Just think about that. So the reason I'm bringing you this, just think about that. If the previous owner, even though he was a Sabbath keeper, but if he wouldn't be consistent in his life, what would have happened? The horse would be confused. He's working 1 Sabbath, he's not working 5 Sabbaths. But he's working some Sabbaths. Then the horse wouldn't know, and then the new owner wouldn't know either. And all of them could be lost too, right? But even the previous owner, even the new owner, they learned about the Sabbath. So if we look about the example of Daniel in being consistent, we see that only by faithfulness in the little things can the soul be trained to act with fidelity under larger responsibilities. God brought Daniel and his fellows into connection with the great men of Babylon, that these hidden men might become acquainted with the principles of true religion. And also it says that in the midst of a nation of idolaters, Daniel was to represent the character of God. How did he become fitted for a position of so great trust and honor? It was his faithfulness in the little things that gave complexion to his whole life. And it says also that there is an eloquence far more powerful than the eloquence of words. Sorry, I think. Yes, this one. There is an eloquence far more powerful than the eloquence of words in the quiet, consistent life of a pure, true Christian. What a man is has more influence than what he says. Do you agree that? Yes, may the Lord help us to understand that whatever we do, whatever we say, this is a greater sermon than what we preach, right? And as God, for some reason I didn't put the last one there, but it says that as God called Daniel to witness for him in Babylon, he calls for every one of us to witness in this world.